book. So we share the same sky, a memoir of memory and migration. But I'm just going to say that a colleague of mine here at JCFS persuaded me to show you, Rachel, and everyone watching what my copy of the book looks like. Okay. So this is what my copy of the book looks like, as
That's awesome.
And trying to remember it. But it speaks a lot for how immersed I became in it, and how there was so much along the way that pulled me along. And so I want to thank you for writing such a wonderful book, so poignant and moving. And I particularly admired the way in which you drew me, the reader, into the journey with you, as if I was there with you. And it really came alive with your prose and your pictures and your stories. So we're delighted that you have actually come to share it with us, and that you have come to Winnipeg, albeit virtually. So, and I do want to say one other thing that we just have to, especially in light of the Stephen Bernstein analogy, we understand that you have actually been to Winnipeg before, Rachel.
Yes,
so
I have.
Tell us just a little about that.
I was in Winnipeg. Oh gosh, I think it must have been like 10 years, 11 years ago. Stephen, you can pop into the chat if I'm wrong there, but I think it was 2011. And our good friend Jonathan and I decided to drive from where Jonathan's from in Minnesota. We drove from Minnesota up to Winnipeg in January. And that was my Winnipeg experience. And I came for a week, and I ate like pretty much every meal at Steve's family's deli. And it was absolutely wonderful. I like just graduated college, and it was awesome. I'm waiting to go back. I recently moved up to Maine, which is like as close as I can get to Canada without before they stop me at the border. So, but yeah, it was awesome. And I hope to be back soon.
Well, you get a lot of points from us for being here in Winnipeg in January.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's a lot. We commend you.
Thank you.
Here now it'd be considerably milder.
Yeah, I think I still have like frostbite on my toes. Like I remember before I came, my dad was like, "Do you have warm weather clothes?" I was like, "I'm from Boston. It's fine." He was like, "No." And then I got up there. I was like, "Oh, no, I do not."
It's a whole different cold. And even though we say it's a dry cold, it's still very cold.
It is.
Well, lovely. So you and I are going to be having a chat tonight, and a kind of informal chat. So I'm going to just start our conversation actually drawing on a quotation from the preface of your book. And the preface was written by Dr. Stephen Smith, who is the executive director of the Shoah Foundation. And he describes you as a descendant who shines a light on the shadow of the Holocaust 2 generations later. That your book really illuminates the meaning of inheritance and identity, which is quite a lovely tribute to you. And I'm just going to quote one thing he did say that really stood out for me. He wrote, "I have never come across a descendant who has so completely lived the life of a forebear as Rachael Cerrotti lived the life of Hannah Dubova, your grandmother. She literally retraced every footstep and went to the places of Hannah's past." So now that we actually have you to talk, Rachel, how would you describe, I guess, the impact of your grandmother's story on you and the impetus to actually write the book?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, Stephen's words are just like, still whenever I like flip through those pages and read them, I feel so lucky that he found me of all places on Instagram many years ago and has become a mentor for me because I feel very grateful for those words. So thank you for sharing them. Well, like, how has my grandmother's story shaped me? I started this when I was 20. So this was not a project that if anybody had said to me, you're about to embark on a decade-long project that's going to change your entire life. And, this story is going to be the lens in which you see not only your personal world, but also the political world around it, would have been like, that's crazy. It was just way too much to take on and wouldn't have been possible if I had that intention. And I think that's what was so gripping about not only my grandmother's story, but about all the living pieces that are still in existence with her story, was that it kept being my support system as my years went on. And so it's one of those strange things where, I'm actually going to quote my grandmother at one point, when at one point in a interview, she's asked, what would your life be like without the war? And she says, I don't know. I have no idea. There's no way for me to know what my life had been like without the war. She was on her own from the age of 14, displaced and orphaned and, a refugee. And, when I think about that notion of just that idea of I just don't know what life would have been, that's kind of how I feel about it. I don't know who I would be as a person if my grandmother's story hadn't become the lens in which not only I saw everything, but also experience everything. Because some of even my closest, like really the closest people in my life are because I engaged in this research. And so I don't even know who would be my people, who would be my chosen family, who would be my real family if this story hadn't come to me. So it's a really hard question to answer, but
yeah. But that's a good start. Well, and apropos of that, one of the things that struck me in the book is in your journey to retrace your steps, you did go back to where she lived and you connected with the descendants of the people who helped her and rescued her. And you formed such connections with them that they became kind of a second family to you. Mm-hmm. And to me, that was pretty provocative and pretty amazing that these people who you had never met, and the link is still through your grandmother generations earlier, have become, as you say, so significant and important in your life.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and let me know when I can read a little bit about the start of the project. So this might be a good time so I can give some background.
Sure.
But yes, so, you know, in a moment, I'm going to read a little passage of the book that kind of sets up how the research began, but kind of going to the second part of the story before the first part of the story. The people that I met in this project it was an incredibly humbling experience, because when I went out to kind of go on the road, I moved to Europe. I had this big, bold idea of like, I'm going to follow my grandmother's story around Europe and around America. And it was this very possessive storytelling experience, like most of us engage in, where it's like, it's my story, my family history, you know, my Holocaust connection, like, and everything was very much filtered through the my and the me. And I started to meet all these other people. And what was incredible about the people I meet along the way and all the characters you'll get to meet in the book is that I met them and they were like, well, this is also my story. And my grandmother's experience, you know, was almost like, my grandmother was like, it was like folklore in their family. Like it was passed, just like it was passed in my family, like one generation to the next. You know, you're a descendant of the Holocaust, like in their family, like one generation to the next, it was passed, you helped save somebody during the Holocaust. Mm-hmm. And that was very profound for me, because it really took the story from being something that kind of lived in this exclusive space of our family experience to something that became much more holistic, much more about the bigger picture of war, the bigger picture of past and present and all. So is this a good time? Should I read a little bit?
Sure. We were hoping you would do a reading tonight. So okay. Why don't you set it up a little bit, maybe, so we know what you're going to be reading.
I will. So just as we engage in this conversation, it'll be helpful for folks who are not familiar with the project to know a little bit of like how the story began. So back in 2009, I was a very say frustrated college student. I like didn't land in the right university for myself. All I knew is I wanted to be a photojournalist. I was just kind of like a little bit all over the place mentally. And I happened to be living near my grandmother for the first time ever, because I grew up in Boston. She was in the greater Philly area. And being nearby her and knowing I wanted to go into a field of storytelling, I kind of had this idea of like, let me ask her for her story. And so I ended up saying to her, like, you know, Mutti, we all called her Mutti, which means mother in German. And I said, Mutti, will you tell me your story? And she was like, oh, no, you've heard it before. And I was like, no, but I'd like to hear it again as you would tell it to a granddaughter. So after some time, she started telling me her story, and that lasted for about a year, a little bit over a year. I would say a few weeks after I asked her for a story and we started these storytelling sessions, I moved to Israel, which is where I met Steve. So he comes in, my dear friend Steve comes in at the very beginning of the storytelling. But so I'm just going to read a bit in what happens in the years that follows and how this whole project kind of came to be. So this is from the early part of the book of We Share the Same Sky. On October 8th, 2010, Mutti passed away. There were no tubes or sterile walls. There were no doctors dictating visiting hours or nurses checking her vitals. Hannah died at home, a place that she had fought so many times over to create for herself. Her body lay peacefully. It was the first time I touched a dead body, but I didn't cry. My memory is in black and white. I remember her skin being cold and soft. I took her hand and kissed it. Surrounding her were her pictures, her writings, and the delicate pages that proved her past. It was everything that I, unknowingly at that time, would come to wrap my world around. In the years after her death, I uncovered the most beautiful archive of her life. It wasn't a hidden archive or a secret one. It was just what she had left behind. It was everything she had told me, curated and edited. There were preserved albums and hundreds of photographs dating back to the 1920s. There were letters waiting to be translated, journals, diaries, deportation, and immigration papers. There were pieces of creative writing from various stages of her life, some marked up with line edits. The archive was seemingly endless. Every time I thought I had found the last box, I discovered another. There were repeated stories, some written at age 14 and others at age 80. There were anecdotes and memories that contradicted each other, bringing the question of memory into all of her stories. There were childhood report cards and souvenirs from her cross-country travels. There were confessions of love, secrets intended to stay private, and flashbacks never intended to be understood. She had written about being a daughter, a sister, a granddaughter, and a cousin, a friend, a student, and a dedicated member of her youth group. She was a strong-willed teen, a refugee, and an orphan. She was a survivor and a victim, a wanderer, and someone who dreamed of home. She was a hopeful immigrant and a forced emigrant. She was an urban dweller and a farmer. She was a pioneer and a storyteller. She was a Czech child, a stateless teen, and an American wife. She was a traveler, an explorer, a teacher, and a student. She spoke 6 languages. She was a divorcee to one and a reignited flame to another. And for other men, she was the one who got away. She was a bride, a mother, and a grandmother, a young person searching for her future, and an elderly person watching her grandchildren search for theirs. I became obsessed with this material, adopting it as my own and taking it with me when I moved back to Boston after graduating from college. My methods of preserving my grandmother's story would have appalled any professional archivist. These were documents and photographs that should have been handled in a clean environment and stored in boxes that were waterproof and fire resistant and let in no light. These were delicate, worn pieces of paper, and yet here I was, sitting on my bedroom floor, moving them from one pile to another and storing them in manila folders with little to no protection. I digitized and organized it all, plucking it from the past and placing it into my present. I learned my grandmother's handwriting. She used the same shaky cursive to caption her photographs as she did to write letters to friends, while titles were always written in block capitals. I scanned every photograph, I retyped every diary. Every word went from her fingertips to my own. I paid close attention to the names and places I found in the archive. These details were found on the backs of photographs, on official documents, within the pages of journals, and on stamped letters sent from one country to another. I listed the names chronologically and took note of how she had gotten from one place to another and which train stations she had stopped at. When my grandmother started telling me her story, she said she had felt like she was going on a big adventure. That's what her archive felt like as well. I began buying books about World War II and the Holocaust. It is the most well-documented genocide from the side of the perpetrators and the victims. I learned the basic facts quickly. World War II began on September 1st, 1939, when the Nazis invaded Poland from the west. A few weeks after that, the Soviet Union invaded from the east. The persecution of the Jews started far before that. I taught myself about the roots of anti-Semitism and the rise of the Nazis. It felt like a puzzle. The history books helped me understand my grandmother's story, and my grandmother's story helped me understand the history books. I'm skipping ahead a couple paragraphs here.
Sure.
With each new photograph I scanned or diary entry I transcribed, I became more and more committed to my grandmother's story. It had been almost 4 years since Hannah had died, and I'd spent too many years buried in her story to not let it take me somewhere. So I decided I would literally follow in her footprints. I would live in every country she had lived in. I would travel the way she had. I would track down all the characters from her journals, all the names listed in her letters and documents. And most importantly, I would try to find the people who saved her life. In her diary, my grandmother called the Holocaust an incomprehensible black page of history. I wanted to know what happens when you turn the page. So that's how it began, and that's how I ended up living with the grandchildren of people who saved my grandmother.
Wow. That's quite a potent excerpt you've shared with us that really captures the fullness of your grandmother, who was quite a personality, which one learns in the book, shares
Yes.
her history and what she went through. And a lot of the book is not only that Holocaust journey, the journey that she took after the Holocaust, and then your journey. And, you know, there's an abundance of quotations, Rachel, about journeys. And one of them is that it's not the destination, but the actual journey.
Mhm.
And so let's just bring it back a little bit, because you're sharing a lot of personal information and your relationship with her. But if we'll just take it for a moment around the message you hope the book conveys beyond your story and hers to maybe Holocaust education in general. What message would you hope people would learn from her story and from the book?
Yeah, I think something that I've become, I mean, there's like a lot of ways I can answer that question. So, but one of the things I've been thinking about a lot recently is how it's not very helpful to learn histories through very exclusive narratives. And I think that was something that I found in the journey of working on this story. And it goes to, like, meeting these other grandchildren, and they were, the descendants of rescuers, and how the history had, been passed from one generation to the next in their family. And it goes back to that idea of possessiveness. Like, growing up, I grew up in an urban school district where I was like one of the few Jews, and but I had a fairly traditional Jewish upbringing in terms of, I was part of a synagogue, and I was aware that this history was around me and part of my my history. But I think when we learn history through exclusive narratives, it makes it really hard to live the present in a really inclusive way. So learning the history of the Holocaust, or learning the story of Jewish people only through the Jewish narrative, I think makes it really hard to, understand the bigger picture. And you could apply that to any group of people. I'm just using this history as an example. And so what I really loved, and I think what really captured me about the process of working on this, was that every time I met a new person, whether it was somebody who was actually alive during that period of history, or whether it was a descendant of, they were offering another way to understand it. They were offering another perspective. They were offering another language to hear it through, or another landscape to look at it through. And that just made it all feel so much more like this is actually our one world. Not to become too cliche about it, but so I hope that when somebody finishes the book, that's one of the things that I hope people take away, is that our individual threads are just part of a larger web. And I think that it's really helpful to understand where our threads intersect with each other, and to understand that something gets pulled over here and it moves over here. And so I hope this story has offered something about that.
I think so, certainly. And I think that's a good way to look at it from the broader perspective, and then sort of the personal one as well. And we're going to talk about the broader parts in a little while later. I want to just take us a little back to your grandmother, who's the focus of the book. And one of the entry diaries that she writes, which I remember being a little taken aback when I read it, she said, "My story is an uplifting one." And I remember thinking to myself that most survivors who might use an adjective to describe their Holocaust story, uplifting isn't usually one of them.
No, it's not.
Yeah. And yet, in her writings, she really does talk about a positive engagement with life, even during the Holocaust, in her experiences, not quite so much in the Czech Republic, but then in Denmark and in Sweden, and then certainly after. And so that says a lot about her. But what would you attribute that to? And how that shaped her journey?
Yeah, well, I think it's really interesting. And what I have done with that concept and the way that I've thought about it, because, well, let me finish. I'll answer you and then I'll go into some other thoughts.
Sure.
I was supposed to jump there.
That's okay.
I think that we tell ourselves the stories that we need to hear. And I think my grandmother carried a lot of deep sadness and a lot of loneliness. And you can see that in her diaries throughout. And, I start the book with being a teenager and my grandmother having this incredibly depressive episode. And it was really scary. I was like young and I didn't understand what was going on. But for a while, my grandmother's mental health was really in a very scary place. And, only upon reflection as an adult do I understand that was survivor's guilt, that was grief, that was all of this stuff during the war that she didn't either have time to process, or didn't give herself permission, or the resources weren't there. At one point, she, says to me, we didn't have, survivor's guilt. That wasn't a thing that people labeled. Mental health was not labeled for her in the way that we are accustomed to mental health being labeled now. And so it came out later in life. But being that my grandmother was a very gifted storyteller and her words are all over this book. At one point I thought about putting her as a co-writer on this book. She is so influential in the way this book is written.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah. But I really think that, spending this much time analyzing all her words. Like, she really tells herself the story she needs to hear. And I think that's part of the defense mechanism. I think that's part of her survival tactic is, my story wasn't an uplifting one. Like, rather than spending time telling my granddaughter all about how, her parents and her brother and her grandparents or aunts and uncles are all exterminated, she's going to tell me the story about how these strangers saved her life. So that was the narrative she chose. And she was very intentional about that. And she makes it very clear she's very intentional about that in various interviews that she's done, in formal testimonies she's given, in conversations she's had with me. And so the thought I was about to jump to was, it's been very interesting, particularly in the wake of the podcast coming out and the book coming out, where I'm talking about this work in, collective circles of people, is I've followed that path with her. And I do think I tell an uplifting story. And sometimes I even really I feel very challenged by that idea, because that feels almost disrespectful. It feels not true. It feels, like whitewashing something. But at the same time, like, that's like, it's helpful for me. It's the story, but it's also how she wanted her story told. Like, she was very, very certain that the reason she was going to tell her story over and over again, the reason she was going to be a vocal survivor, was because she wanted people to know that collectives, that communities could do collective good as well as collective bad. Her parents and her brother, they were killed because of the collective bad, and she was saved because of the collective good. And she felt like that needed to be shared. And so, so I've followed her in that way.
Yes. Well, there's a term that I came across, and I don't know if you've heard of it, Rachel, called melancholic memorialization. And it was,
I love that.
Yeah, and it resonated with me, because I know there's, among Holocaust scholars, there's almost not a controversy, but there's some reluctance around the continuous defining of survivors by the trauma they lived. And because, as Al mentioned in the introduction, so many survivors that I grew up with were the most alive people I met. That they were life affirming, and they wanted to move forward. And the Holocaust was certainly a piece of their history, and certainly a piece of the trauma they carried and passed on, but they didn't want to be defined solely by that experience. And I think that somehow comes through with your grandmother, and furthermore with the journey you took when you met other people who were life affirming as rescuers and not only as victims. So I think that's a really potent analogy to make, frankly.
It is. And it's been interesting because, this deep dive into my grandmother's life has led me into this career where I get to work with all types of family stories. And I get to know a lot of Holocaust survivors and have gotten to befriend a lot of them, which has been such a pleasure and so wonderful. And I was actually like having a happy hour with one of my friends who's in her 90s the other day, who's a Holocaust survivor. And we were talking about this and she was saying that it wasn't until later in life that she even realized she was a survivor. She had to actually ask a rabbi, because she wasn't in the camps. And that was kind of an idea that she thought she couldn't be a survivor if she hadn't been in the camps.
Right.
But also we had this whole conversation that was really, I think, important for me to hear, about how she was like, nobody really characterized me as a survivor until I got older. And now that's the only thing I'm identified as. And she was really struggling with that as an identity, and as, a younger generation who's working in this field, I really took that to heart. That, I don't know, it was just important. I don't have further reflection on it, but I just thought it was really important to hear. And I really appreciate her sharing it with me.
Absolutely. And it's interesting. You state somewhere in your book that what started off as sort of a journey to look at family history became something much more. And it became the intersection of your grandmother's story with your story. So let me just bring you back into it. We'll get back to your grandmother and think about the journey you took, the 10 years that you took to find out about her, to kind of walk along with her as you retrace the steps. So obviously it had an impact on your life. So I'm wondering if you feel like talking about any events in your life over those 10 years that challenged or shaped the way you inherited those memories.
Yeah, absolutely. So the book is very much an entwining of my grandmother's life and my own. And that was not the intention when I started it, but it became pretty clear early on. And when I say early on, I mean like 5 or 6 years in, that when I after I had come back from like, certain rounds of traveling and started talking about this, like even when I was trying to pitch it in certain like media spaces, everyone wanted to know like, my thoughts. And so either way, like it was very clear that it was like going to be funneled through my perspective, and it had to be, and that was what was going to make it relevant, that, and, but, I started this when I was 20. I'm in my 30s now. A lot of stuff happens in your 20s. I had a particularly traumatic filled 20, also a lot of joy and a lot of beauty. But there were certain events that happened in my life that really changed the way in which I experienced my grandmother's story and also how I told my grandmother's story. So there's two I'll mention. One is that when I was traveling, I did this like first set of travels in 2014 to 2015, and I like subletted my apartment and took a backpack and like had a very like gung-ho nomadic journalist spirit and was like, I'm gonna go do it, and I like raised the money. And it was during that year when I was first meeting all of the people that you meet in the book. It's like I didn't just show up to their house once, but I like went back and back and back. This was the first time meeting all of them. And in 2015, the refugee crisis, the current refugee, I don't know if we call it current, but the refugee crisis that, as we know it now, really came to the forefront of our consciousness, international media, was around 2015. And suddenly you had hundreds and thousands of people fleeing Africa and the Middle East and trying particularly to get up to Scandinavia, which is where a lot of my research was taking place. And Denmark, Sweden have historically been very welcoming for refugees. It's also been, Sweden is very well known for family reunification, which is why a lot of people wanted to get there, because they thought if one person could get there, more family members could get there. So I was focused on this story, which had to do with my grandmother being saved by the Scandinavians and then being a part of the rescue of the Danish Jews, which is a big part of this book. And for those who aren't familiar with Danish history, Denmark saved over 95% of their Jewish population by illegally ferrying them to Sweden. My grandmother was on that rescue. So I was having this parallel imagery of looking back in time and looking at this rescue and looking at the way Scandinavia gave refuge to Jews during the war. And simultaneously in the media, in the news, in person, I'm watching all of these people try to get asylum in these spaces. And so that really impacted. And there's a lot that happens in the book that speaks to what was happening in contemporary times, kind of through the lens of the past, and vice versa, what was happening in the past through the lens of contemporary times. So that was one thing. The other thing is in my personal life. So when I met Steve, Steve and I met at Hebrew University. I also met a man named Sergio, who would later become my husband, and he was Polish. And we were like best friends for 5 years, along with Steve. We had a whole little crew. And when I relocated to Europe, Sergio and I started off on a little romantic relationship. So it was really thanks to my grandmother's story that I was coming to Europe and we started dating. And he ended up, just being a huge part of this with me. And he immigrated back to America when I came back here, and we got married. And then just shy of a year of our first wedding anniversary, he passed away very suddenly from an undiagnosed heart disease. And so I was 27 and I was widowed. And I was 7 years into this research, and immediately, like when I say immediately, like that night, and I write about it in the book, like that night at the hospital, thinking about my grandmother's story and feeling like, how could I have ever told this story without understanding grief? And there was this big crisis that existed inside of me for a long time of, was I a bad journalist? This was not something that really was, I had written like a full-on manuscript at this point. Like I didn't realize there was another 5 years of research in me after that. But it really changed how I saw my grandmother's stories. And so kind of going back to that idea that her story was an uplifting one, I had been writing her story and understanding her story almost like there was this like badge of honor of good mental health, because she was writing her story through this perspective that I now kind of see as a form of self-defense a little bit in a healthy way. But I started to go back to the diary entries, and I started to go back to the writings, and I started to go back to everything and seeing kind of all the spaces in between, and being able, because of my own personal experience of losing my husband, being able to see like all the things left unsaid, or all these words that I just skipped over before, or diary entries where she was talking about grief that maybe before I read it, but it just didn't resonate in a way that I pulled it out and was using it. And so that really changed everything. And then I went out and retraced everything again with this new life experience. And the last thing I'll say on that, I'm happy to talk more about it, but just one thing I do want to say is that a lot a lot of the people I had met during this project ended up becoming the people I leaned on after Sergio passed away.
Mhm.
They were in Europe. They had met him, many of them, but they knew me. They were meeting me in this time of my life when I was getting engaged and getting married and doing all these like, like milestone moments. And then after he passed away, they were the people who said, come stay with us. And being able to stay engaged in my grandmother's story was really like a lifeline for me in getting through that. So that all is in the book, and that, very much changed the way I wrote the book.
Course. And the thing about grief, and as you say, hearing some of your grandmother's grief and your own grief, and I am sorry for your loss,
Thank you.
is about these people that you met were links to both these significant people in your life. The people you met in Europe and Scandinavia were links to your grandmother, and they were also links to Sergio. And so for you, they had meaning on many, many different levels.
They do. Yeah.
And I just want to say, Sergio's mother, who you write a bit about in the book, she's the one who actually gave the name of the book inadvertently, because when I looked at the cover and I thought, we share the same sky, I just assumed it was probably you share the same sky when you were in Europe as your grandmother did when she was there, but it's really not that. The comment is attributed to her. I don't know if you remember it, but I was quite touched by it. If you want to maybe just take a moment and refer to it.
Yeah. So I kind of like love that about the book, and that was it. I think that going out and doing this type of storytelling, it was really important for me to, I wanted the story to be unexpected, in a sense that it was unexpected. The way it unfolded was unexpected. And this was like one of like the best, most heartwarming examples of that, I think. So a few months after Sergio passed away, he was from Poland, and that's where his parents still are. And I'm incredibly close with them to this day. Like, I text his mother every day. We have a great friendship. And it was like around Christmas time, and it was like late night, like 2 a.m, and we're drinking wine and eating cheese and just crying and sharing stories and just being very, just in love with each other as family members. And she was telling me, all these memories of Sergio, and about how her mother always wanted her to be very, very close. Like, she grew up in communist Poland, and like, her mother, she was saying that like her mother wanted her like touching on the couch, like very close. So when Sergio grew up and started, he went to school in London, and then he and I met in Israel, and then he wanted to immigrate to America. And she remembered her mother saying to her, like, how can you let your son go to all these places? She said, well, we share the same sky. And so that's what she would say to him when he would leave, was like, we share the same sky. It's okay. It's okay that you're far away. We share the same sky. And she said those words to me. And I remember just like looking at her and being like, Danuta, like, that's the name of the book. Yeah. I mean, this was before there was a podcast, before there was like, I'd been calling the project by a different name. But it was like, those times when somebody just says something to you and you're like, yep, that was life-changing. And so yeah,
it resonated. Absolutely. And it resonated with me throughout the book. And then when I actually heard how she put it, it resonated with me as somebody who works with survivors, who was enjoying the book, and as a parent. So it had a lot of layers of meaning. So
that's wonderful to hear. Yeah.
If you don't mind, Rachel, I'm going to just switch us a little bit so we cover a number of different things. And I'm going to have us look at the concept of intergenerational differences.
Yeah.
And certainly those of us working in the field know the concept of intergenerational transmission of trauma. And there's also intergenerational transmission of memory. And seeing the work you've been working on is the concept of memory, identity, and inheritance. One of the things that I found interesting in the book is you and your mother had journeyed together at one point, and your mother is the daughter, one of 3 children of your grandmother, Hannah, and you are one of 7 grandchildren. But you and your mother were together, and I'm just going to do the quotation just so people can feel the differences, because that's what I want us to maybe just chat for a few minutes, the differences between how 2nd generation inherits and lives with memory and 3rd generation. So in your book, you write, and I quote, "My mom has echoed the sentiments of carrying the grief of her mother's generation. It's an inheritance I personally don't often feel the weight of. The way I see it is that time has turned the pain into responsibility." And I really like that, but I'd love for you to elaborate on what you mean by responsibility.
Yeah. So I feel really grateful that both my parents are very into family history. I say, like, the apple didn't fall far from the tree, because I had a lot of support going into this, and like shared curiosity, which I think was very helpful. And my mom and I actually got to go back to some places in Europe together. And it's funny, like they've come back with me after I've explored, but I started exploring with them a little bit. And my mom went with her mom back. She was like the child who wanted to go with her
Yeah.
mom back to see Czechoslovakia, to see Denmark and all these places. So I've gotten very lucky to have these conversations with my mom very, very early on. And there's one part of the book early on, before I moved to Europe, like this is like the week Sergio and I started dating, like very early on in this research, where my mom and I were back in Kolín, Czech Republic, which is the town where my grandmother was born. And we were brought there by the mayor as almost like, you know, there was an exhibition happening of the Jewish community, and we were kind of brought in as like, you know, proof, like, see, there were Jews here once. And it was a strange experience. And all these reporters were asking us all these questions. And my mom felt this very deep heaviness about it all. And so they're asking her how it feels to be back there. And it's very heavy answers. And at this time, I'm like, you know, early mid 20s, maybe like 24, 25. And they're asking me how it feels. I'm like, oh, this is really cool to be back here. Granted, I think that, and I've thought about this a lot. So, you know, we had these two very different answers. And my mom was like very taken aback, like, cool. What do you mean it's cool? And so we ended up having this really important conversation very early on about how different it was that we were experiencing this. And it's interesting that even that conversation has matured as the years have gone on. I mean, I was very early on in understanding the gravity of the war. Like I understood the war, but not the way I understand it 10 years later, you know, whatever, 8 years later, however long it's been. My experiences are I have many more experiences to understand that the words cool probably wouldn't come out of my mouth. I don't know if those were exact words, but that sentiment I would probably share some of the heaviness further. But one of the conversations that transpired from that also, and it's actually in the podcast, can't remember if it's in the book, where my mom has said to me, I don't want you to feel the pain that I feel, because if you feel that much pain, we can't move forward as a society. Like if every descendant feels the pain of those who came before them, like how would we ever move forward? How would any of us ever be okay if we carried all that pain all the time? And I've really, really taken that to heart. So what do you do with pain? Like, it's not just something you just get rid of. It doesn't just dissolve. I mean, time helps, I guess, but like for many of us, like we have to put action to it in some way. So sometimes that's through writing. I think writing is a great way to deal with pain. But I think that looking at it as a responsibility. And so as I was going forth and working on this project and writing this book, it was like, why? Like, is this a selfish endeavor to write this book? Am I going to meet all these people? Like, am I just writing another Holocaust biography? There's a lot of those out there. Am I trying to come up with something new? And these are all questions that I still ask myself. And I don't know if I have, satisfactory answers for them. But that idea of responsibility, of just this constant questioning and trying to understand, what does this mean for me today? Mm-hmm. How does my experience, my inherited experience with this war and with this period in history and with the Holocaust, like, what does this mean for the way that I engage with my community, with who I am as a person, with what policies I vote for, with the way that I treat strangers, with the way that I treat people with accents, like all of these things from the small to the big. And that's more of how I feel it. And I can't, my mom has said, like, she would never have been able to do a project like this. And it has nothing to do with like professional skills. It has to do with like, she's just too close to the story.
Right.
And I don't, it's not her responsibility to try to understand what her pain means. I think it needed to skip a generation because it's just too visceral. Exactly. So that's kind of where the conversation got. But I'm so grateful that I get to talk to her about all of this, because it's helpful for me. Like you can't skip the second generation and get to the third generation.
No,
and I think
the third generation wouldn't be dealing with what it's dealing with without the second generation. So each of them is part of the process, starting with the survivors themselves, of course. And I guess what I liked about your word pain into responsibility is that it creates a sense of hopefulness. And we know that we all heal, no matter what trauma, when there's some sort of action or movement to kind of undo the trauma, and not undo it or forget it, but simply to work with it. And
Mhm.
one of the things that we've discovered in our work here at JCFS is, and we learned this from survivors, we mentioned it earlier, and so did you from your grandmother, about the importance of taking their experience and moving forward with learning and applying those lessons in some way. So our understanding, and this is what I picked up from you, is that action can mean writing a book, as you say, but action by third generation is often about how do we take the words never again and make them more than just words? How do we translate them into actions that do combat racism and injustice and bigotry and prejudice and all the things that gave rise to the Holocaust? And
Yeah.
so that has meaning not only for third generation, but for the second generation, and ultimately for the survivors who can see that their stories have meaning beyond what they lived through and how it will be moving forward. So I really
Absolutely.
felt that in your book quite a bit, and
I'm
the
glad.
book is one way, certainly. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm glad. And I'll comment on that and just say, my grandmother, in the weeks before she passed away, she was obsessed, like obsessed with the notion of, why did I survive? And that was like, I remember, as I was 21 when she passed away, and those words really stuck with me. And I think I give them a lot of credit for why I went out and did this work, because as her descendant, you're like, what do you mean, why did you survive? But it was so poignant for her. And she really was like, I didn't write a book, I didn't cure a disease. Like, she couldn't tangibly touch something
Yeah.
that would have made her survival feel important or necessary. And I think that part of deep down, like somewhere deep down inside of me, I think that every day along all this work has just been like trying to just give her that answer. So now it's like, I see, the podcast is being taught in classrooms around the world, and people are responding to the book, and I'm getting other people sending me their family histories, and because the work I do with Shoah Foundation, I get to send them stories about their family history that they didn't even know exist. And it's kind of like, at least I know, maybe if she was here, one of
Yeah.
those, like, I'd be like, see, like,
Absolutely.
so
Absolutely. It's empowering you and your generation to do it, and it gives meaning to their suffering.
yeah.
If she could see it, I'm sure she would say that to you, that it gave sort of a new meaning to what she lived through and to survivors in general. I'm just conscious of the time,
Mhm.
Rachel. I just want to stop us for a minute because
Yeah.
it's about 10 minutes to 8, and we did promise everybody that they might have an opportunity to ask some questions. So if you're okay with that, why don't we maybe peek into the chat so that people have a chance? And if not, I always have more to talk about, but why don't we give that a go? So I think, Al, you were going to moderate or keep an eye on the chat for us.
Yes, I've been keeping an eye on the chat. I will have to say, I think that people are completely riveted to the conversation. And it's not atypical of Zoom webinar types of programs like this. I think I'm riveted. So I have been monitoring the chat. There have been a couple of comments so far. That it's a wonderful conversation and a beautiful program. Thank you. We are about 10 minutes to the hour. And I don't think that we're bound by time unless you are, Rachel. So we just did have a question pop in, which is, was your grandfather also a survivor? And did that play into the story? Would be my additional comment to that.
Yeah, so my grandfather was a German Jewish refugee. He was able to get over here. I would consider him a survivor. I mean, he had to flee Germany, and he was able to get out in 1938. And his family was quite wealthy. So the kids were sent to New York to be with family members, and the parents hid in the countryside in England throughout the war. And so very different trauma of being separated very early on from your family, but they were able to spend the duration of the war in America. And then my grandmother and him met later on. But I will say, he's a character in the book. He comes in. My grandmother does. They end up getting divorced at a certain point. He passed away. That grandfather passed away when I was very young, so I did not know him very well. The grandfather that I remember growing up with was a man named Bernd Drucker, who my grandmother's just a little romance story. My grandmother met in the years in Denmark after the war. This was the man who helped get her first plane ticket ever to go back to Czechoslovakia to see who was alive. And he was a German Jew who was helping Jewish people in Europe get reparations, get their property back. He was a lawyer. And him and my grandmother had a little dating thing, and he wanted to marry her. And she was like, I mean, you'll see like throughout the book, my grandmother's a very like stubborn woman and like very opinionated, like knows what she wants and does what she wants. That was part of her part of her charm. And she was like, yeah, I'm probably going to go to America. And he was like, well, a woman should stay where a man is. And she was like, no, I don't think so. And so he was like, well, if I don't marry you, I'll never marry anybody. And he didn't. And like years later, they reunited. It's not like a love story for the ages, the way that like she felt about it all, but it's a love story for grandchildren to hear. It's an awesome like war reunion. So there were two men in her life that she married. Both were German Jews who survived the war.
Mhm. I have more questions, but I'm just wondering how if there are.
Well, there was sort of a sub note to that question was, if so, how did Hannah's experience affect their relationship? In this case, relationships. I think you covered that a little bit in just what in your comment.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know how, like from an interpersonal point of view, I'm not quite sure. I will say though that I had to petition my mom to like let me have my grandmother's diaries, particularly the ones from later on in her life. I was like early 20s and I hadn't proven myself as a journalist. And it took me a little bit of time to be like, I promise you, I'm going to read them as a journalist and it's not going to change how I feel about my grandmother and da 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 da. And eventually she did let me have them, but she did rip out some pages of them where my grandmother goes too deeply into her relationship with her husband, her first husband, because I didn't know him very well. And I think my mom was trying to preserve the grandfather I didn't really know, which I think was probably the right decision by my mom, because I don't, we all get angry in our diaries about sometimes the people we're with. So I don't think that was my business.
Well, exactly. And parents want to protect their children in one way or another. And I think
and their parents. Yeah.
And exactly. And your mother was very clear how much you were attached to your grandmother and how much your life and hers intersected. And I think she wanted to preserve some of that to some degree by maybe not having you read that.
Yeah. Exactly.
But when we talked earlier, or I mentioned earlier to you, Rachel, the abundance of quotations about journeys in life, and they're all kind of meaningful and poignant. But one of them by the philosopher Rilke talks about, and I wrote it here because I thought it was interesting. It's the only journey is the one within. And so you've done a journey outside into the world, yours, your grandmother's, the intersections, but the journey within. And you talk about your grandmother's issues about the survivor guilt and her own sense of self, but and you've talked about how committed you were to her story and you were compelled to be the curator of her archives. But if you don't mind going inside yourself for a minute, what do you think really compelled you, one of 7 grandchildren, to be the one who did this, who felt that you had to do this kind of journey in your life related to your grandmother?
Yeah. It's an interesting question. So a couple of weeks ago, I gave, it was my first like in-person talk since the pandemic began, at my home synagogue, the synagogue I grew up in, because my bat mitzvah parsha was Lech Lecha, which is to go forth, and it's all about journeys. And I gave a speech. It was the 20th anniversary of my bat mitzvah. So I went and I spoke about the book and spoke to this because it was like, as a child, I was even very adamant to my mom. I was like, if I'm going to have a bat mitzvah, it's going to be parsha Lech Lecha. I was not a religious child. I was not like a biblical child. Like, I don't know why this was like so deep inside of me, but I just think from the time I was very, very young, I was just very drawn to the idea of journeys. Like, that's just who I was. And it's funny, like a lot of other things about my childhood, like I loved scrapbooking. That was like a big hobby of mine, which I mean, it's kind of just like what I did with my grandmother's life for the past 10 years.
In a way,
in a way, yeah. It's just like trying to bring pieces together. And like my favorite childhood book was all about like the passing of memories from one generation to the next. So there were certain things I think that I just like were inside of me that this story, this project kind of it was just biologically like who I was and my interests. And then, the other piece of that, so it's like a nature v nurture situation a little bit, but the other thing is that I wanted to be a photojournalist. Like I was going into a field of professional storytelling and I was very romantic about that field. And, I felt like I could have written a book about my grandmother's life sitting on my bedroom floor with all of, the archive that I described in that passage. But to be a photographer, to be a photojournalist, like you got to be out there. And like you can't just show up to somebody's house once to get a good photograph. Like being a photographer means that you build a lot of trust with people, and you have to spend a lot of time not picking up your camera so they're comfortable when you do. And so I think that just that professional drive paired with my just natural curiosity and like being drawn to journeys, the two just together. And then everybody I met along the way who just kept saying, yeah, come back. And I kept being like, okay. So all those things came through together.
Did you have any idea when you embarked on that journey that it would unfold the way it did in terms of all the descendants you met who welcomed you into their homes and into their hearts, really? Did you think that?
No,
No.
not at all. Not even close. And I mean, so many people along the way. I mean, even there were like the characters you'll meet in the book, like they introduced me to each other.
Yeah.
I didn't even know. And, you know, it's one of those things where you don't know what questions to ask until you know too much sometimes. Like, even when I first asked my grandmother her story, there were so many questions I left out because I just didn't have enough information to even know what I wanted to ask. And so I think that just with every new person, just a new interest opened up. And so, you know, I didn't know that it would bring me into this space of working with young refugees. So like part of this work brought me into doing documentary work with young refugees today. That was a piece of it. And then, you know, I didn't know that after my husband passed, I did a whole documentary project about young widowhood. So I traveled around America photographing young women who had lost their partners. And we talked about grief. That's all we talked about. And so all the stories and all the work I'd done with survivors suddenly were playing, like the lessons that I got from them. It had nothing to do with the war, but the lessons that I got with them as they dealt with incredibly traumatizing, unexpected life situations were suddenly playing into this other world that I was now a part of, and this other topic that I was exploring. And so, you know, it's like that web again, like all of these things that were seemingly so separate from each other just started to harmonize in this way that just felt very natural.
Absolutely. The interrelatedness of all of that. And sometimes you don't know what you're going to find until you take that step. So the other famous journey thing, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with one step. So there's lots of them.
It's true.
It's true. If I can jump in here, that's a great segue. I'm mindful of the time and of everybody's time. And we did have one question that might be a really good wrap up for you, Rachel, and for you, Adeena. You know, what would you tell your grandmother today if you could tell her about this book and this journey?
Oof.
You were just speaking about journeys, so
yeah,
that is a good question.
Oh God, there's so many things I would ask her. What I would tell her would be, I don't know, like, I think that I would just be like, can you believe how many people know who you are? Like, you know, it's like I have students are studying her words, and, you know, people are like quoting her back to me. And it's just like, you know, goes that other thing, like, see, like, this is like your life meant so much to so many people. And also, like, do you know how good of a writer you were? I like want to be like, do you know how good of a writer? Like, I mean, she was such a beautiful writer. I mean, even from her journals when she was 14 years old, I'm like what 14-year-old thinks the way that she did was like mind boggling to me. So I think I would just want to be like, do you want to be like my like coworker? Just to write another book together. So
it sounds like she would certainly feel honored that you were honoring her legacy in doing this.
I hope so. I have a little piece at the end of the book where I kind of ask myself this question, and, you know, and I think that she's, you know, a part of me is like that she's just like, oh, come on, go care about something else. You know, I think she'd be a little bit bashful about it.
Well, that's certainly part of the personality that I picked up in the book too. Yeah.
So there was a comment there about, you know, could your book be made into a movie? But I will turn it over to you, Adeena, to close off the evening for us. And I think we probably need to welcome you post-pandemic, Rachel, to Winnipeg again in person, not in January. It's much nicer in the summertime, and we should definitely try to host an in-person event with you.
I would love that. And I will
Well,
definitely be in Winnipeg. I mean, Steve and I text often where I'm like, is Canada open for me yet? So
I think it is. It has
I
been.
think it just opened. Yeah.
You got in
Yeah.
before we got into your country. But I will hear what Al is saying, that we're going to officially wrap up, and I'm going to officially thank you, Rachel, certainly on behalf of Jewish Child and Family Service and all of us watching and listening. Thank you so much for coming to Winnipeg this way, sharing your book and your story of yours and your grandmother so eloquently written. And it meant a lot to us that you decided to choose us and come in and let us know what you've been working on and how much meaning this book has to us and to other people in other generations. We'll all take a piece of it with us. So thank you so much for making the time, and we're very grateful to you for being here. Thank you.
Thank you all. It's been such a pleasure, and I just appreciate it so much. And I look forward to meeting you all in person one day.
We do too. Thank you. And thank you all of you who came and listened and for your interest in our program.
Thank you so much. Good night.
Good night. Bye, Rachel.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks.